April 18th, 1943, 07:25 hours. Fighter Strip Number 1, Guadalcanal. The jungle heat was already oppressive as Captain Thomas Lanfear, Jr. climbed into the cockpit of his P-38 Lightning, his gloved hands gripping the twin control yokes. Around him, 17 other Lightnings sat scattered across the Marston matting, their twin booms and central nacelles gleaming in the early morning sun like steel dragonflies preparing for the hunt. The air smelled of aviation fuel, hot metal, and the ever-present rot of tropical vegetation that no amount of bulldozing could eliminate.
Lanfear adjusted his oxygen mask and glanced at his wingmen, Lieutenant Rex Barber, already strapped into his own aircraft 20 yards away. Both men knew what they were about to attempt. Both men understood the odds. Deep in Japanese-held territory, over 400 miles of enemy-controlled ocean and jungle, flew a single Mitsubishi G4M bomber carrying Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the mind behind Japan's Pacific offensive, and perhaps the most valuable target in the entire theater of war. The P-38 Lightning beneath Lanfear was a curious machine, and he knew exactly what the enemy thought of it. Japanese pilots had been calling it Futago no Shippo, two tails, and not as a compliment. In the early months of the Pacific War, when Zeros dominated the skies with their incredible maneuverability, Japanese commanders had openly mocked the American twin-engine fighter. Too bulky, they said, too heavy for dogfighting. Its twin booms made it an easy target, its size made it slow to turn, and its unconventional design was just another example of American engineering attempting to compensate for inferior pilot skill. At Imperial Japanese Navy air bases from Rabaul to Bougainville, intelligence officers had dismissed the Lightning as a bomber escort at best, dangerous in a straight line perhaps, but helpless in a turning fight against the nimble A6M0. One report, intercepted and translated by Allied intelligence, had described the Lightning as a flying warehouse, large, visible, and full of holes waiting to be made. But that was before pilots like Lanfear and Barber learned how to use it.
The P-38 wasn't built for turning dogfights. It was built for something else entirely: speed, altitude, range, and firepower. Its twin Allison V1710 engines could push it to 414 miles per hour, faster than any Japanese fighter at altitude. Its concentrated nose armament, one 20mm cannon and four .50 caliber machine guns didn't require convergence math or guesswork. Everything pointed straight ahead, and when you fired, everything hit exactly where you aimed. And its range, with drop tanks, the Lightning could fly farther than any single-engine fighter in the Pacific. It was a hunter's weapon, an assassin's tool. And on this morning, 18 of them were about to prove it. Major John Mitchell, the mission commander, gave the signal. Engines coughed to life down the line, their roar building into a synchronized thunder that rattled through the palm trees. Mitchell had planned this mission with obsessive precision. 435 miles to the intercept point. Dead reckoning over open ocean, no landmarks, no radio navigation, nothing but Mitchell's calculations, a compass, and a watch. They'd fly 15 feet above the waves to avoid Japanese radar, hugging the deck for over an hour and a half, fuel consumption measured to the gallon. The intelligence was too perfect to waste. American codebreakers had intercepted Yamamoto's itinerary, decoded his exact flight path, departure time, and arrival schedule. The Admiral, always punctual, would be flying from Rabaul to Alalei Island in the Shortland chain. 2 bombers, 6 Zero escorts. Yamamoto would be in the lead bomber. The Japanese had no idea anyone was coming.
Lanfear pushed the throttles forward. The Lightning surged down the runway, Marston Mat blurring beneath him, jungle vegetation streaking past in his peripheral vision. The nose lifted. The main gear left the ground. And then he was airborne, climbing into the brutal equatorial sky, his fighter loaded with fuel, ammunition, and a single crystallized purpose. Behind him, 17 more Lightnings followed. They formed up in 2 groups, Mitchell's covering force of 14 aircraft, and the killer section, Lanfear, Barber,
Lieutenant Besby Holmes, and Lieutenant Raymond Hine. 4 men tasked with the actual interception. 4 men who would attempt what no one in the Pacific Theater had ever done: execute a long-range aerial ambush for the specific target, hundreds of miles from base, with split-second timing. Mitchell banked northwest and dropped to wave-top altitude. The formation followed, descending until spray kicked up from the prop wash, and the Pacific Ocean became a blue-green blur just beneath their landing gear. Radio silence. No navigation lights. Nothing but 18 fighters skimming the water at 300 miles per hour, invisible to Japanese radar, racing toward a rendezvous with history. The Mockery was about to end. For 93 minutes, the formation flew in near-perfect silence. No radio chatter, no course corrections announced over the airwaves. Just the relentless drone of 36 Allison engines and the occasional hand signal from Mitchell as he checked his watch, his compass, and the endless expanse of ocean stretching in every direction. Inside his cockpit, Lanfear fought the monotony with focus. Flying this low required constant attention. One moment of distraction, one slight dip of the nose, and the Lightning would cartwheel into the Pacific at 300 miles per hour. His eyes moved in a steady rhythm. Airspeed indicator, altimeter showing barely 50 feet, engine temperatures, fuel gauges creeping steadily downward, then back outside to the horizon where sky met water in a hazy blue line. The fuel situation was knife-edge tight. Mitchell had calculated they'd have exactly 10 minutes over the target area. 10 minutes to find Yamamoto, intercept his bombers, engage, and break off before their tanks ran dry. Any combat maneuvering, any extended dogfight, and they'd be swimming home. The external drop tanks gave them the range, but once those were jettisoned for combat, every second counted. At 09:33 hours, the dark smudge of Bougainville Island appeared on the horizon. Mitchell's arm shot up, the signal to climb. 18 Lightnings nosed upward in formation, breaking free from the ocean surface, climbing through 1,000 feet, then 2,000, engines roaring as pilots pushed throttles to military power. The covering force would stay high, around 18,000 feet, ready to intercept the Zero escorts. The killer section would go low, boring straight for the bombers.
Lanfear's heart rate kicked up. His hands were steady on the controls, but his senses sharpened to a razor edge. This was it. Intelligence said Yamamoto's flight would arrive over Bougainville at 0935 hours. It was 0934. If the codebreakers were wrong, if the Admiral had changed his schedule, if the Japanese had altered the route at the last minute, then 18 P-38s were about to run out of fuel over enemy territory for nothing. Mitchell's voice crackled over the radio, breaking 90 minutes of silence. Bogies, 11 o'clock. High. Lanfear's eyes snapped to the left. There, silhouetted against a bank of white clouds at about 4,500 feet, 2 dark shapes. Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, their distinctive cigar-shaped fuselages unmistakable even at distance. And above them, 6 smaller dots, the Zero escorts, weaving lazy figure-eights in a protective pattern. The Japanese had no idea death was climbing toward them at 300 knots. "Skin 'em off," Mitchell ordered. The command to jettison drop tanks. Lanfear hit the release. 2 165-gallon tanks tumbled away from his wings, his Lightning suddenly lighter, more responsive. Around him, 36 drop tanks fell toward the jungle canopy below like discarded shells.
The killer section broke away from the main formation. Lanfear, Barber, Holmes, and Hine dove toward the bombers, while Mitchell's covering force climbed to engage the Zeros. The plan was surgical. Ignore the escorts, hit the bombers, get out. But plans, as Lanfear knew, rarely survived contact with the enemy. The lead Betty, Yamamoto's bomber, began a shallow descent toward Balalay Airfield, clearly unaware of the 4 American fighters screaming up from below. The Zero escorts continued their patrol pattern, professional but complacent. Why wouldn't they be? This far behind Japanese lines, over Japanese-held territory, with radar stations and air bases scattered throughout the Solomons, no American fighter had the range to operate here. Everyone knew that. Everyone was wrong. Lanfear armed his weapons, 4.50 caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon, all mounted in the nose,
all pointed dead ahead. 500 rounds of .50 cal, 60 rounds of 20mm high explosive. When those guns fired, they fired as one, a concentrated stream of destruction that converged exactly where his gun sight showed. No wing-mounted guns that required range estimation, no convergence point to calculate, just point and shoot. At 1,000 yards, the Japanese spotted them. The Zeros reacted instantly, breaking their patrol pattern and diving toward the killer's section. Mitchell's covering force pounced, 12 P-38s slamming into the escort fighters with the advantage of altitude and surprise. The sky above erupted into a whirling furball of aircraft. Zeros trying to turn inside the heavier Lightnings, P-38s using speed and firepower to offset the Japanese maneuverability advantage. But Lanfear ignored it all. His focus was singular, the lead bomber, now banking hard left toward the jungle, trying to escape at treetop level.
"I'm on the first Betty," Lanfear's voice cut through the radio chaos. He pushed the stick forward, diving after Yamamoto's bomber as it plunged toward the jungle canopy. The bomber pilot was good. He was using the only advantage he had, dropping to ground level where the P-38's speed would be negated and one wrong move would send Lanfear into the trees. The Betty skimmed over the jungle at perhaps 200 feet, its gunners already firing, tracers reaching back toward Lanfear's Lightning in glowing orange arcs. Behind him, Lieutenant Hine radioed, "3 Zeros on your tail, Tom." Lanfear didn't look back. Couldn't look back. He had one chance, one firing opportunity before those Zeros chewed him apart. The range closed. 800 yards, 600, 400. The Betty filled his gun sight, its twin engines clearly visible, the white surrender star painted on the fuselage. Wait, not a surrender star. The rising sun insignia, growing larger with each passing second. 300 yards. The Zero pilots behind him opened fire, 7.7mm rounds snapping past his canopy. Lanfear pulled lead, his gun sight tracking slightly ahead of the bomber, compensating for deflection, for airspeed, for the fact that his target was maneuvering desperately to survive. 200 yards. His thumb found the firing button, and Thomas Lanfear Jr. opened fire on the man who had planned Pearl Harbor.
The 20mm cannon roared first, its deeper bark distinct even through the engine noise and rushing wind. Then the 4.5 caliber machine guns joined in, creating a hammering vibration that shook the entire airframe. 5 streams of fire converged into a single point of destruction, every tracer round visible as it reached out across the narrowing gap between hunter and prey. The first bursts went low, kicking up dirt and vegetation in the jungle below as Lanfear adjusted his aim. Then the stream walked upward, across the Betty's tail section, stitching a line of impacts along the fuselage. Metal peeled away in bright flashes. The bomber's rear gunner stopped firing, either dead or diving for cover, as 20mm explosive rounds tore through the thin aluminum skin. Lanfear held the trigger down, the firing solution perfect now, watching his rounds chew into the Betty's right engine. Smoke erupted, thick and black, streaming back across the wing. The bomber shuddered, its pilot fighting to maintain control as one engine died and the airframe took catastrophic damage. 100 yards. Lanfear was close enough now to see details. The bomber's windows, the dark shapes of crew members inside, the rivets on the fuselage skin. Too close. The debris from his own gunfire was a hazard now, and the Zeros behind him were closing, their own tracers getting nearer with each passing second. He pulled up hard, the G-forces slamming him down into his seat as the Lightning climbed away from the stricken bomber. As he banked right, Lanfear caught a glimpse of the Betty rolling to the left, its descent steepening, smoke pouring from the shattered engine. It was going down.
But he couldn't watch. 3 Zeros were on him now, their pilots burning with rage at seeing their admiral's bomber falling from the sky. Lanfear shoved the throttles to the firewall and pointed the Lightning's nose toward the ocean. The P-38's speed, the attribute Japanese pilots had mocked as irrelevant, became his salvation. At full power, the Lightning accelerated past 400 miles per hour, pulling away from the Zeros as if they were standing still. The nimble Japanese fighters, so deadly in turning combat, couldn't match that straight-line speed. They couldn't even come close. Below and behind him, Admiral Yamamoto's bomber disappeared into the jungle canopy. While Lanfear fought for his life against the pursuing Zeros, Lieutenant Rex Barber had gone after the second Betty. His approach had been different, more deliberate, coming up from behind and below while the crew focused on Lanfear's attack. Barber closed to point-blank range, perhaps 150 yards before opening fire. His concentrated nose armament tore into the Betty's tail and fuselage with surgical precision. The bomber's gunners returned fire desperately, but accuracy from a maneuvering bomber against a fighter pilot who'd trained for this exact scenario was nearly impossible. Barber's rounds found the left engine first, then walked across to the right, both power plants erupting in flames almost simultaneously. The Betty didn't try to run. It couldn't. With both engines destroyed and its control surfaces damaged, the bomber simply rolled inverted and dove straight into the jungle, erupting in a massive fireball visible for miles.
Above them, Mitchell's covering force had done its job. The 6-0 escorts were scattered, disorganized, 2 of them trailing smoke and limping back toward Bougainville. The Japanese pilots were skilled, aggressive, and brave, but they'd been caught by surprise, outnumbered 2-1, and forced to fight the Lightning on terms that negated their maneuverability advantage. When a Zero tried to turn fight, the P-38 pilots simply refused to engage, using their speed to disengage and reposition. When a Zero got on someone's tail, another Lightning would slash through in a high-speed pass, forcing the Japanese pilot to break off or die. It was a new kind of aerial combat, not the swirling dogfights of 1942, but something more calculated, more methodical. The P-38 pilots had learned what their Japanese counterparts refused to accept. Speed and firepower could defeat agility if used correctly. "All Lightnings, this is Mitchell. Bug out. Head for home." The order came at 09:43, exactly 10 minutes after the initial intercept, precisely as Mitchell had planned. Fuel was critical now. Every Lightning had burned through its reserves during the climb, the combat, and the hard maneuvering. Staying even another minute risked running dry before reaching Guadalcanal. The formation reformed, or what was left of it, and turned southeast, dropping back to wave-top altitude. Lanfear rejoined, his Lightning undamaged despite the close calls. Holmes was there, and Hine. Barber's voice came over the radio, calm and professional. "Splash 1 Betty, confirm kill." Mitchell did a quick count. 18 aircraft had departed Guadalcanal. 18 were heading home. Not a single Lightning lost. Against Japanese-held territory, against Zero escorts, against every advantage the enemy possessed, not one American pilot had been shot down. But the most important question remained unanswered. Which bomber had carried Yamamoto? The flight back was tense, fuel gauges creeping toward empty with agonizing slowness. Several pilots reported their low fuel warning lights flickering. Mitchell held the formation at optimal cruise speed, fast enough to get home quickly, slow enough to conserve every gallon. The mathematics were unforgiving. 435 miles back to Guadalcanal, approximately 90 minutes of flying time, and tanks that might or might not hold enough fuel. Lanfear ran the scenario through his mind repeatedly during that flight. He'd hit the lead bomber, the one intelligence said carried Yamamoto. He'd seen it smoking, descending, clearly going down. But had he actually seen it crash? Had the pilot somehow recovered, limped back to a Japanese airfield? And if Barber had destroyed the second bomber, which one had the Admiral been in? At 11:10 hours, the green mountains of Guadalcanal appeared on the horizon like a vision from heaven. Pilots began calling out their fuel states, 20 gallons, 15, running on fumes. Mitchell led them straight in, no approach pattern, no waiting for clearance. 18 Lightnings descended toward fighter strip number 1 in a ragged stream, each pilot focused entirely on reaching that Marston matting before his engines quit. Lanfear touched down with his fuel gauge reading empty, not low, but actually bottomed out. His engines continued running as he taxied clear of the runway, but the moment he shut them down, maintenance crews would discover his tanks held perhaps 5 gallons. 5 gallons between success and swimming in the Pacific. As the pilots climbed from their cockpits, intelligence officers were already waiting. The questions came rapid fire. How many bombers? Which one went down first? Did you see a crash site? Were there any survivors? What about the Zeros? But the answer that mattered most, whether Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was dead, would take 18 more hours to confirm. The debriefing took place in a sweltering tent at Henderson Field, where Major Mitchell's pilots sat on folding chairs and recounted every detail of the mission while intelligence officers scribbled notes and asked pointed questions. Maps were spread across makeshift tables, and both Lanfear and Barber traced their attack runs with fingers still trembling slightly from adrenaline comedown. The disagreement began almost immediately. Lanfear insisted he'd shot down the lead bomber, the one carrying Yamamoto, according to the intelligence breakdown. He described seeing his rounds strike the right engine, watching smoke pour from the fuselage, observing the Betty roll left and descend into the jungle. His claim was backed by Lieutenant Hine, who'd been fighting off Zeros but had caught glimpses of Lanfear's attack. Barber was quieter, more measured. He'd destroyed a Betty, no question. He'd seen it explode on impact with the jungle. But which bomber had been which? In the chaos of combat, with aircraft maneuvering violently and Zeros attacking from multiple angles, positive identification was nearly impossible. Both bombers had been Mitsubishi G4Ms. Both had looked identical. Both had gone down within seconds of each other. The intelligence officers didn't push for resolution. What mattered was confirmation that both bombers had been destroyed. If Yamamoto had been aboard either one, he was dead. The identity of who specifically killed him could be sorted out later, or not at all. For 18 hours, the men of Operation Vengeance waited while coast watchers, intelligence assets, and reconnaissance flights tried to locate the crash sites deep in Japanese-held jungle. Radio intercepts from Bougainville revealed unusual activity, encrypted traffic surging between Rabaul and Tokyo, medical personnel being rushed to the Shortland Islands, and what appeared to be a high-level emergency response underway.
Something important had happened, but confirmation required evidence. On April 19th at 15:20 hours, the message arrived from a Coast Watcher network operating behind Japanese lines. Australian Lieutenant Lee Vile, positioned on Bougainville with local scouts, had reached one of the crash sites. His radio transmission was brief, encrypted, and definitive. Betty bomber located 3 miles southwest of Buin. Wreckage scattered. Multiple bodies recovered by Japanese search parties. Positive identification. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet, killed on impact. Repeat, Yamamoto confirmed dead. The message passed through intelligence channels with extraordinary speed. Within 2 hours, it reached Admiral Chester Nimitz at Pearl Harbor. Within 6 hours, it was on Fleet Admiral Ernest King's desk in Washington. Within 12 hours, President Franklin Roosevelt received confirmation in the Oval Office. The architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who'd orchestrated the attack that killed 2,403 Americans and brought the United States into the war, was dead. Killed in a meticulously planned ambush, shot down by American pilots in American fighters over Japanese-held territory. But here's where the story became complicated. The United States possessed the most valuable intelligence asset in the Pacific: the ability to read Japanese naval codes. American cryptanalysts had broken the JN-25 code system, giving Allied commanders access to Japanese fleet movements, operational plans, and command-level communications. Operation Vengeance had been possible only because codebreakers had intercepted and decrypted Yamamoto's exact itinerary.
If the Japanese discovered their codes were compromised, they'd change them immediately, and America would be blind. So on April 21, 1943, Admiral Nimitz made a decision that would frustrate the pilots of Operation Vengeance for years to come. The mission would remain classified. The public would not be told. The pilots would not be celebrated. No medals, no press conferences, no recognition. The official story would be that a routine patrol had happened to encounter enemy bombers and engage them. Pure chance. Dumb luck. Lanfear and Barber were forbidden from discussing the mission or their claims. Mitchell's entire squadron was sworn to secrecy. The intelligence officers who'd planned the operation were gagged. Even the codebreakers who'd made it possible were ordered to never speak of it. The Japanese, meanwhile, conducted their own investigation. Their crash site analysis revealed both bombers had been shot down by enemy fighters. That much was obvious from the wreckage and witness statements. But how had American aircraft been present 435 miles behind Japanese lines? How had they known Yamamoto's exact route and timing? Japanese intelligence considered several possibilities: spy networks on Rabaul, visual spotting by coast watchers, simple bad luck, The possibility that their naval codes were compromised was discussed and ultimately dismissed. The encryption was too complex, the security too tight. It had to be something else. They never changed the codes, and American intelligence continued reading Japanese naval communications for the rest of the war.
In Japan, Yamamoto's death was treated as a state secret for weeks. The admiral was too important, too symbolic of Japanese naval power. Announcing his loss would damage morale across the military and civilian population. So the Imperial Japanese Navy invented a cover story. Yamamoto was inspecting forward bases and would return shortly. His staff continued issuing orders in his name. His flagship remained at sea, flying his flag as if nothing had changed. On May 21, 1943, more than a month after his death, Tokyo finally admitted the truth. A terse radio broadcast announced that Admiral Yamamoto had met a gallant death in a warplane while directing operations at the front line. The language was deliberately vague, the circumstances unexplained. The Japanese public mourned, unaware of how precisely their greatest naval commander had been hunted. Back on Guadalcanal, the pilots who'd flown Operation Vengeance tried to process what they'd accomplished. They'd executed the longest fighter interception mission in history. They'd navigated over 400 miles of open ocean using dead reckoning. They'd achieved tactical surprise against an enemy in his own territory. They'd shot down both target bombers without losing a single aircraft. And yet, officially, it had never happened. The mockery from Japanese commanders, the dismissal of the P-38 as too bulky, too slow, too clumsy for real combat, had been answered in the most definitive way possible. The flying warehouse had just assassinated the most important military figure in the Japanese Pacific Command structure. But the hunters couldn't tell anyone about it. The strategic impact of Yamamoto's death rippled through the Pacific War in ways both immediate and profound, though most of it remained invisible to the public for years. Admiral Minechi Koga was appointed Yamamoto's successor as Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet on May 21, 1943, the same day Tokyo publicly announced the admiral's death. Koga was competent, experienced, and respected. He was also not Yamamoto. The difference mattered enormously. Yamamoto had possessed an almost mystical status within the Imperial Japanese Navy. He'd studied at Harvard, served as naval attaché in Washington, and understood American industrial capacity better than perhaps any officer in the Japanese military. He'd opposed war with the United States, correctly predicting that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year, but would ultimately be crushed by American production. When overruled by the militarists in Tokyo, he'd planned Pearl Harbor as a gamble, a knockout blow meant to give Japan negotiating leverage before America's industrial might fully mobilized. His strategic vision had shaped every major Japanese naval operation from 1941 through early 1943. His loss left a void that no successor could fill. Koga lacked Yamamoto's political capital with the Naval General Staff in Tokyo. He lacked the personal relationships with carrier division commanders built over decades. Most importantly, he lacked Yamamoto's willingness to challenge conventional thinking. Where Yamamoto had been bold, sometimes recklessly so, Koga was cautious. Where Yamamoto had imposed his strategic vision on reluctant subordinates, Koga sought consensus.
The Japanese Navy began fighting differently almost immediately. Operations became more conservative, more reactive. The aggressive carrier raids that had characterized the first year of the war gave way to defensive positioning and incremental responses. Japanese naval aviation, already bleeding experienced pilots at an unsustainable rate, lost the centralized strategic direction that might have preserved its remaining strength. American commanders noticed. Intelligence reports documented increased hesitancy in Japanese naval operations, delayed responses to American initiatives, and what appeared to be command paralysis during critical moments. Admiral Nimitz, reading these assessments in his Pearl Harbor headquarters, understood what had been accomplished on April 18th, even if the public did not. For the P-38 Lightning, Operation Vengeance marked a turning point in its Pacific reputation. The mockery stopped. Japanese pilots who dismissed the twin-engine fighter as ungainly and slow began treating it with wary respect. Intelligence reports captured from Japanese bases showed revised tactical assessments. The Lightning was dangerous at altitude, deadly in high-speed attacks, and possessed range capabilities that made no location in the South Pacific truly safe. The aircraft that Japanese commanders had laughed at had reached out across 435 miles of ocean and jungle to kill their most important admiral. The message was clear. American fighters could go anywhere, strike anything, and return home. The vast distances that had protected Japanese bases and made their officers feel secure were no longer protection at all. Pilots who had been flying the type refined their tactics further, developing the high-speed slash-and-run techniques that would dominate Pacific air combat for the rest of the war. The Lightning never became a dogfighter. It didn't need to. It was a hunter, and the Pacific theater was its hunting ground. Charles Lindbergh, visiting P-38 squadrons as a civilian consultant in 1944, flew combat missions and developed fuel management techniques that extended the Lightning's range even further. By war's end, P-38s were routinely flying missions that would have been considered impossible in 1942. 8-hour patrols covering 1,000 miles, deep penetration strikes against targets in the Philippines and Formosa, long-range bomber escorts to the Japanese home islands. The aircraft the enemy had mocked ended the war as the mount of America's two leading aces, Major Richard Bong with 40 kills and Major Thomas Maguire with 38. Both flew P-38s exclusively. Both developed tactics that exploited the Lightning's strengths and avoided its weaknesses. Both proved that in the hands of a skilled pilot, the bulky twin-engine fighter was as lethal as anything in the sky. But for Lanfear and Barber, the years after Operation Vengeance were complicated by a question that should have been simple. Who shot down Yamamoto's plane? When the mission was finally declassified in September 1945, after the war ended and the code-breaking secret no longer mattered, both pilots were credited with the kill. The official record stated that Lanfear had attacked the lead bomber while Barber destroyed the second, and since Yamamoto had been in the lead bomber, Lanfear received primary credit. Barber disagreed, publicly and repeatedly. His version of events, supported by his own combat report and testimonies from other pilots, claimed he'd shot down both bombers. According to Barber, Lanfear had been engaged with Zeros and never successfully attacked a Betty. The bomber Lanfear claimed to have hit had actually been destroyed by Barber in a follow-up pass after dealing with the second aircraft. The controversy became bitter, personal, and ultimately unresolvable. Lanfear maintained his account until his death in 1987. Barber stuck to his version until he died in 2003. Historians, researchers, and veterans of the mission lined up on both sides, analyzing gun camera footage that didn't exist, debating combat reports written in the chaos immediately after landing, and examining Japanese records that sometimes contradicted both American accounts. Modern analysis suggests the truth lies somewhere between both versions, that the chaos of combat, the similar appearance of both bombers, and the compression of events that occurred within seconds made positive identification nearly impossible. What remains undisputed is that both men flew a mission of extraordinary difficulty. Both engaged enemy aircraft successfully, and both contributed to an operation that killed one of Japan's most important military leaders. The debate over individual credit, while understandable, ultimately missed the larger point. Operation Vengeance succeeded because 18 pilots flew a mission at the absolute edge of their aircraft's capabilities. It succeeded because American codebreakers provided intelligence of unprecedented precision. It succeeded because Major Mitchell planned every detail with obsessive care. It succeeded because ground crews maintained the aircraft perfectly despite jungle conditions. It succeeded because everyone involved, from President Roosevelt who authorized the mission to the Coast Watchers who confirmed the kill, performed their roles flawlessly.
And it succeeded because the P-38 Lightning, the aircraft Japanese commanders had mocked as too bulky and slow for modern combat, proved to be exactly what the mission required. Fast enough to reach the target, deadly enough to destroy it, and durable enough to bring every pilot home alive. In the decades following World War II, Operation Vengeance became a case study in military academies, intelligence schools, and strategic planning courses around the world. Not because of the dogfight, though the aerial combat was impressive, but because of what the mission represented:
The integration of intelligence, technology, planning, and execution into a single, surgical strike against a high-value target. The concept seems routine now, in an era of drone strikes and precision-guided munitions, but in 1943 it was revolutionary. Consider what the mission required. Sentinel's intelligence capable of intercepting and decrypting enemy communications in near real time. Navigation across 435 miles of open ocean with no electronic aids, using only compass, clock, and calculation. Coordination between 18 aircraft maintaining radio silence for over 90 minutes. Split-second timing to intercept a target whose exact position and velocity had to be predicted days in advance. And the discipline to execute all of this, knowing that a single mistake, a navigation error, a mechanical failure, running out of fuel, would result in death or capture hundreds of miles behind enemy lines. Modern Special Operations Forces study Operation Vengeance because it pioneered what would later be called direct action missions, small teams, high-precision, strategic targets. The 1976 Israeli raid on Entebbe, the 2011 raid on Osama bin Laden's compound, the targeted killings of terrorist leaders throughout the 21st century all trace their conceptual lineage back to that April morning over Bougainville when American fighters hunted an enemy admiral with clockwork precision. The ethical dimension of the mission sparked debate then and continues to provoke discussion now. Was Operation Vengeance an assassination? Was it a legitimate military operation? Does the distinction matter?
Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox, when asked about the operation after the war, was blunt. Yamamoto was the commander of Japanese forces in the field. He was a military target, no different than a battleship or an airfield. We destroyed him the way we'd destroy any military asset. Admiral Nimitz took a harder line in private correspondence. Yamamoto planned and executed the attack on Pearl Harbor while American diplomats were still negotiating in Washington. He conducted war without declaration, without warning. What we did to him was more mercy than his pilots showed the men who died at their battle stations on December 7th. Yet, even among American military leaders, there was discomfort. Some felt that targeting a specific individual, tracking his movements, planning his death with such precision, crossed a line from warfare into something darker. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall reportedly expressed concern that the operation set a precedent that could justify enemy attempts to assassinate American commanders. The Japanese certainly saw it that way. Post-war interviews with surviving Japanese naval officers revealed deep anger about Yamamoto's death, not because he'd been killed in combat, that was an honorable death, but because the precision of the interception suggested treachery. The belief that spies or traitors had revealed Yamamoto's itinerary persisted in some Japanese military circles for years, even after American code-breaking capabilities were publicly revealed.
The irony is that Yamamoto himself might have appreciated the operation's execution. He'd spent years advocating for naval aviation, for long-range striking power, for the kind of bold operational planning that Operation Vengeance exemplified. He'd built the carrier force that attacked Pearl Harbor specifically to demonstrate that naval power could reach across oceans to strike targets previously considered untouchable. He died because Americans learned that lesson and applied it better than his own forces could counter it. For the P-38 Lightning, the vindication was complete but largely unrecognized by the public. The aircraft continued serving throughout the war in both theaters, accumulating an impressive record. More Japanese aircraft destroyed than any other American fighter in the Pacific. Critical reconnaissance missions over Europe, and successful deployment in roles from ground attack to night fighting. Yet the Lightning never achieved the iconic status of the P-51 Mustang or the F-4U Corsair. It was complex to maintain, expensive to produce, and required more pilot training than simpler single-engine fighters. When the war ended, P-38s were quickly retired, scrapped in massive numbers, and largely forgotten by everyone except the pilots who'd flown them and the enemies who'd faced them. P-38 ace Saburo Sakai, who survived the war with 64 kills, was asked in a 1980s interview which American fighter he'd most feared. His answer? The P-38. When we saw twin-engine fighters coming, we knew the pilot was experienced and the aircraft was dangerous. The Lightning pilot who knew his aircraft's strengths could not be caught. He would not dogfight. He would make one pass very fast, his guns very accurate, and then he would be gone before we could respond. Many of my friends died that way. They never even got a chance to fight back. That assessment, from a pilot who'd mocked the Lightning in 1942, represented the complete reversal in Japanese tactical thinking that Operation Vengeance had accelerated. The aircraft wasn't a joke. The tactics weren't flawed. And American pilots weren't the inferior adversaries that Japanese propaganda had claimed. In Bougainville, the jungle eventually reclaimed both crash sites. Yamamoto's bomber wreckage was partially salvaged by Japanese recovery teams who retrieved the admiral's body and personal effects for a state funeral in Tokyo. The second Betty, the one Barber destroyed, was left where it fell, slowly consumed by vegetation and decay. Locals tell stories about both sites. During the 1960s and 70s, wreckage hunters and war souvenir collectors picked over the remains, removing pieces of aluminum, engine parts, and personal items. By the 1990s, little remained beyond some scattered debris and the memories of elderly villagers who'd witnessed the crashes as children. There's a small memorial now, erected in the 1990s near where Yamamoto's bomber came down. It's modest, a stone marker with Japanese and English text noting that this was where Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto died on April 18, 1943. Tour groups occasionally visit. Japanese veterans organizations have held ceremonies there. It's become a place of quiet reflection, far removed from the violence and strategic calculations that made it significant.
No memorial exists for the P-38 pilots who flew Operation Vengeance. No stone marker, no plaque, no official recognition beyond what appears in military records and history books. Lanfear and Barber lived long lives. Lanfear became a businessman and occasional military consultant. Barber returned to civilian life and rarely spoke of the war. Both carried their conflicting memories of that April morning. Both insisted on their versions of events. Both went to their graves knowing they'd accomplished something extraordinary, but never receiving full recognition for it. Major John Mitchell, the mission commander whose navigation made everything possible, received a Navy Cross, the nation's second highest decoration for valor. His citation carefully avoided mentioning Yamamoto by name or explaining why the mission mattered. It praised his extraordinary leadership and tactical skill during a long-range interception mission and left it at that. The other pilots received various medals and commendations, all carefully worded to obscure the mission's true nature. The ground crews who'd maintained the aircraft, the intelligence officers who'd planned the operation, the code breakers who'd made it possible, none received public recognition until decades after the war ended. And perhaps that's appropriate. Operation Vengeance succeeded not because of individual heroism, though there was plenty of that, but because of systematic excellence across every aspect of the operation. It was a team effort, a coordinated application of intelligence, technology, and tactical skill that achieved a strategic objective with minimal losses. It was, in short, exactly the kind of warfare that would come to define American military operations for the rest of the 20th century and beyond.
To understand why Japanese commanders initially mocked the P-38 Lightning, you have to understand the context of 1942. For 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japanese naval aviation dominated the Pacific with a combination of superior aircraft, veteran pilots, and tactical doctrine refined through years of combat in China. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was, at the war's outset, arguably the finest carrier-based fighter in the world. It could outturn anything the Allies possessed. It could outclimb most opponents. Its range was extraordinary, over 1,900 miles with drop tanks, allowing it to escort bombers on missions that Allied fighters couldn't even attempt. In the hands of experienced pilots who'd been flying combat missions since 1937, the Zero seemed invincible. Against that backdrop, the P-38 looked like a design mistake. It was huge. With a wingspan of 52 feet, it was larger than some medium bombers. Its twin-boom configuration was unconventional, complex, and seemingly fragile. Early models suffered from engine reliability issues, particularly at high altitude where the turbochargers would fail. The cockpit was cramped, visibility was compromised by the booms, and the concentrated nose armament, while theoretically advantageous, had never been proven in large-scale combat. Japanese intelligence reports from early 1942 reflected genuine puzzlement. Why would the Americans build such an aircraft? It violated every principle of fighter design that had been validated in combat over China, Spain, and Europe. Japanese doctrine emphasized maneuverability above all else, lightweight, excellent visibility, tight turning radius. The Zero embodied that philosophy perfectly, and it had been winning. So when P-38s began appearing over the Pacific in late 1942, initially in small numbers and flown by pilots still learning the aircraft's characteristics, Japanese aviators treated them with something close to contempt. They were big targets. They were slow to accelerate in a turn. Their pilots seemed reluctant to engage in dogfights. What kind of fighter refuses to fight? The answer? A smarter one. American pilots and tacticians, analyzing combat reports and loss rates, realized something the Japanese doctrine refused to acknowledge. You don't have to outturn an opponent if you can outrun him, outclimb him, and kill him before he knows you're there.
The P-38's weaknesses in turning combat were real, but they were irrelevant if you never turned. Instead, American pilots developed boom and zoom tactics. Dive from altitude, make a single high-speed firing pass, then use superior speed to climb back to altitude before the enemy could react. The Lightning's concentrated nose armament meant that brief firing pass was devastatingly effective. All 5 weapons converged on a single point, and what they hit stayed hit. The range advantage, which Japanese intelligence had noted but not fully appreciated, became crucial as the war progressed. While Zeros could fly far from their carriers, they needed those carriers to be relatively close to the combat zone. The P-38, operating from land bases, could reach targets that put Japanese naval forces at risk without ever coming within striking distance of American positions. By early 1943, Japanese pilots were reporting increasing encounters with Lightnings that fought unfairly, refusing to dogfight, attacking only when they had overwhelming advantage, breaking off engagements rather than continuing to a decisive conclusion. What seemed like cowardice to pilots trained in Bushido's warrior ethos was actually sound tactical doctrine developed through brutal trial and error. And then came Operation Vengeance, which proved the Lightning's capabilities in a way no amount of tactical success could match. The mission demonstrated that American fighters now possessed greater operational reach than Japanese naval aviation. The sacred space behind the front lines, where commanders, supply ships, and administrative centers had operated with relative safety, no longer existed.
Operated with relative safety no longer existed. After April 18, 1943, no Japanese officer could feel secure anywhere within 500 miles of an American airbase. Flight schedules became unpredictable. Inspection tours were shortened or canceled. The movement of high-ranking personnel required elaborate security measures that consumed resources and degraded efficiency. All because 18 P-38s had flown 870 miles round-trip to kill one man. The psychological impact extended beyond officer safety. Japanese fighter pilots, already facing unsustainable attrition rates, now had to worry about Lightnings appearing anywhere, anytime, with enough fuel to fight and still make it home. The range advantage created a persistent sense of vulnerability that affected tactical decision-making at every level. It's worth noting that the Lightning wasn't perfect. The aircraft had significant flaws that were never fully resolved. The cockpit heating system was inadequate at high altitude, leaving pilots dangerously cold during long missions. The twin engines created unique maintenance challenges. You couldn't simply replace one engine, you had to carefully balance both to avoid asymmetric thrust issues. The tricycle landing gear, while modern, was fragile and prone to failure on rough airfields. In the European theater, the P-38 struggled. German pilots quickly learned its weaknesses and exploited them ruthlessly. The Luftwaffe's tactical doctrine, emphasizing energy fighting and coordinated attacks, negated many of the Lightning's advantages. Engine failures at high altitude, where German fighters operated most effectively, resulted in heavy losses. By late 1944, most P-38 units in Europe had transitioned to P-51 Mustangs.
But in the Pacific, the Lightning found its perfect environment. The vast distances, the need for long-range capability, the prevalence of single-engine Japanese fighters that couldn't match its speed, all of these factors made the P-38 ideal for the theater. It was the right aircraft, in the right place, flown by pilots who'd learned to use it correctly. The Japanese never really adapted. Their tactical doctrine remained wedded to maneuverability and close-in dogfighting, even as their pilot quality declined and American fighters evolved. New Japanese fighters like the Kawanishi N1K, George, and the Nakajima Ki-84, Frank, had better performance than the Zero, but they appeared too late and in too small numbers to matter. And they were still designed around the same tactical philosophy that American pilots had learned to defeat. By 1945, P-38s were roaming across the Pacific with near impunity, flying missions that would have been inconceivable 3 years earlier. They escorted B-29 bombers to Japan, flew reconnaissance over Chinese ports, strafed targets in the Philippines and Formosa, and hunted Japanese aircraft wherever they could be found. The aircraft that had been mocked in 1942 ended the war having destroyed more Japanese aircraft than any other American fighter type, over 1,800 confirmed kills, plus hundreds more probables and ground victories. Lieutenant Thomas McGuire, the P-38 pilot who finished the war as America's second-highest ace, perhaps said it best in a letter home in late 1944. The Japs used to laugh at this airplane. They called it slow and clumsy. Now they run when they see us coming, and if they don't run fast enough, they don't get to run at all. We're not faster than them in a turn. We're faster where it matters, and we hit harder than anything they've got. That's not the airplane they were laughing at. That's the airplane that made them stop laughing.
McGuire died in January 1945 when his P-38 crashed during a dogfight over the Philippines. He was 24 years old, 3 kills short of Richard Bong's record, and posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. His aircraft, the one he'd flown on dozens of combat missions, the one he'd used to destroy 38 Japanese aircraft, was never recovered from the jungle where it fell. But his assessment of the Lightning lived on, validated by thousands of combat missions and codified in tactical manuals that would influence fighter doctrine for generations. The aircraft Japanese commanders had mocked became the symbol of American air power's evolution from desperate defense to overwhelming dominance. And it all began, in many ways, on that April morning when 18 Lightnings flew further than anyone thought possible to hunt an admiral who'd believed himself beyond reach.
In the end, Operation Vengeance accomplished something that went far beyond the death of one man, however important. It represented a fundamental shift in the nature of warfare, the moment when intelligence, technology, and tactical execution combined to make distance irrelevant and safety an illusion. Admiral Yamamoto understood this better than most. He'd built Japan's carrier striking force specifically to project power across vast oceanic distances. He'd planned Pearl Harbor as a demonstration that no target was truly safe, that the age of defensive fortifications and static lines had ended. The carriers and their aircraft were the future, mobile, lethal, capable of appearing anywhere and striking without warning. On April 18, 1943, that doctrine came full circle and destroyed its architect. The Americans had learned the lesson Yamamoto taught at Pearl Harbor, refined it, and applied it with ruthless efficiency. They'd combined signals intelligence with long-range aviation to create a capability that could reach across hundreds of miles to eliminate a specific individual on a specific flight at a specific time. It was precision warfare before the term existed, special operations before the doctrine was formalized, strategic assassination executed with tactical perfection. The P-38 Lightning made it possible, not because it was the best fighter in the world, it wasn't. Not because it could outturn or outclimb every opponent, it couldn't, but because it had the specific combination of capabilities that the mission required: range, speed, firepower, and reliability. In the hands of pilots who understood its strengths and limitations, the Lightning became something the Japanese hadn't anticipated and couldn't counter. A long-range hunter that could go anywhere, kill anything, and return home.
The mockery from Japanese commanders in 1942 reflected genuine tactical analysis based on sound combat experience. The Zero's philosophy of extreme maneuverability had worked brilliantly for years. The P-38's design seemed to reject everything that combat experience validated. From a Japanese perspective, the Americans were building the wrong aircraft for the wrong reasons. What they failed to understand was that the war was changing. The desperate dogfights of 1942, where individual pilot skill and aircraft maneuverability determined outcomes, were giving way to something more systematic. American industrial production was flooding the Pacific with aircraft faster than Japan could replace its losses. Radar was making surprise attacks increasingly difficult, and American pilots were learning that you didn't need to outturn an opponent if you could outthink him. The Lightning embodied that evolution. It was a thinking pilot's aircraft, an engineer's solution to tactical problems, a weapon designed not for individual duels, but for systematic dominance. It required discipline to fly effectively, the discipline to refuse a turning fight, to break off when advantageous, to prioritize mission success over personal glory. That discipline, more than the aircraft's technical capabilities, was what made it lethal. Major Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber, whatever their disagreements about who shot down which bomber, both demonstrated that discipline on April 18th. They flew 435 miles on instruments and calculations, maintained radio silence for 90 minutes, navigated precisely to an intercept point using nothing but dead reckoning, and executed their attacks knowing that any mistake would be fatal. That their post-mission dispute over credit became bitter and personal doesn't diminish what they accomplished. It makes them human.
The 18 men who flew Operation Vengeance were not superhuman. They were skilled professionals doing an extraordinarily difficult job under conditions that offered no margin for error. Some of them, like Lanphier and Barber, would become famous. Others, like the pilots who flew top cover and engaged the Zeros, remained largely anonymous despite performing equally critical roles. Major Mitchell, whose navigation made everything possible, received proper military recognition but never became a household name. That anonymity, in some ways, is appropriate. Operation Vengeance succeeded because of systematic excellence, not individual heroism. Every person involved, pilots, ground crews, intelligence officers, codebreakers, even the coast watchers who confirmed the kill, performed their specialized roles flawlessly. It was modern warfare in microcosm, complex, integrated, dependent on technology and intelligence as much as courage and skill. And it worked. Admiral Yamamoto died in the jungle of Bougainville, far from the fleet he'd commanded and the carriers he'd championed. His death didn't end the war. Japan fought on for more than 2 years, inflicting and suffering horrific casualties. But his absence created a strategic void that was never filled. Japanese naval operations after April 1943 lacked a coherent vision and bold execution that had characterized Yamamoto's command. The combined fleet became reactive rather than proactive, conservative rather than innovative.
Whether that change was decisive is debatable. American industrial superiority would likely have prevailed regardless of Japanese leadership. But Operation Vengeance accelerated the timeline, degraded Japanese effectiveness, and demonstrated capabilities that changed how both sides approached the war. For the P-38 Lightning, vindication was complete. The aircraft Japanese commanders had mocked as too bulky and slow had reached out across impossible distances to kill their most important admiral. The twin booms they ridiculed carried engines powerful enough to escape any pursuer. The concentrated nose armament they dismissed as unproven had destroyed both target bombers in seconds. The laughter stopped. It never started again. Today, Only a handful of P-38 Lightnings remain airworthy. They appear at air shows occasionally, their distinctive twin-boom silhouette still unmistakable even 70 years after the war ended. Spectators who watch them fly rarely know the full story of Operation Vengeance. They see a unique aircraft, impressively restored, a relic from an earlier era of aviation. They don't see the weapon that hunted an admiral across 435 miles of ocean. They don't understand the tactical revolution it represented. They don't know the Japanese commanders once laughed at it, or that those commanders learned, too late, that some jokes come with lethal punchlines. In Bougainville's jungle, nature has completely reclaimed the crash sites. Yamamoto's memorial marker still stands, maintained by occasional visitors and local caretakers. But the wreckage is gone. The evidence scattered or corroded, the physical traces of that April morning erased by 7 decades of tropical weather and vegetation.
What remains is the story, the mission that proved distance was no protection, that demonstrated how intelligence and technology could combine to eliminate any target, that showed the future of warfare with clarity that military planners are still analyzing today. And at the center of that story, 18 P-38 Lightnings flying further than anyone thought possible, hunting an admiral who believed himself beyond reach, flown by pilots who'd learned to use a mocked and dismissed aircraft to perfection. The Japanese commanders who laughed in 1942 never got the chance to laugh again. The Lightning made sure of that.